Hey guys, welcome back to Gideon Stuff and welcome to another adventure video. This video is going to be a little bit different, and by a little bit I mean a lot different. You see, I thought this was going to be a short little video where I take a short little hike to a tiny little cave and nothing really happens. It was going to be a breath of fresh air for you guys. Instead of an hour-long adventure video, it was going to be a nice, crisp 10 minutes or so. It was going to be awesome. Or so I thought. And that's what I get for thinking. Today, we're going to explore and dive into the controversy behind Sandia Cave. Sandia Cave has been on my list of places to see for a while now. I knew it was easy to get to, and it was located in an area that I haven't spent too much time exploring. I wanted to make an adventure video about the Sandia Mountains as a whole and spend multiple days exploring them, but I have not had the time or opportunity to do that. However, I was passing through the area on this particular afternoon a few weeks ago. Man, I started writing this script a long time ago. A few weeks ago, and decided to just run to the cave and check it out as a fun little side quest. As you all know, I absolutely love exploring caves and old mines. It makes sense, right? I live in New Mexico, which is known worldwide for its caves. You may have heard of some little places like Carlsbad Caverns, Snowy River Cave, Lechuguilla Cave. You know, just some small little holes in the ground. Ask any of my friends. If Gideon invites you to come on a hike, there's a very good chance you'll end up underground. That sounds like a threat. I promise it's not. I just like sharing my love of caves with people. I love climbing mountains and hiking through forests, but I really, really love being underground. I might have been a badger or a mole in a past life. I don't know. The point is, I love caves. I could nerd out about caves all day. In fact, one of my good friends is a speleologist. But we're actually not going to talk all that much about speleology in today's video. I first heard about Sandia Cave many years ago. When I was in high school, I had several friends who were from the Albuquerque, Bernalillo, Rio Rancho, Placitas area, and they told me about the cave. It was a common, kind of hangout spot for teenagers, a place to go and have some adventures, get into some trouble, and all of them also said that the cave was haunted. Now, I do not know the lore behind this legend. I don't know why the cave is rumored to be haunted or who it's haunted by, and frankly, I don't care one bit, because the real story behind this cave is absolutely bonkers. Usually this is the part of the video where I start talking about geology and rambling about tectonic provinces, but not today. The geology of this cave actually isn't all that compelling. It's a limestone cave of modest size, eroded into Pennsylvanian age cliffs. There's a lot of caves like that in New Mexico. A lot. However, this cave has a fascinating anthropologic history. Now, I'm a geologist, not an archaeologist, and I'm definitely no Milo Rossi, but this story is so bizarre, so unbelievably nuts, that I have to tell it to you. I just have to. I have no choice. I do want to make it clear, though, that I may overlook some archaeological details or nuance that is important to the story simply because I'm not a trained archaeologist. Looking at you, Milo Minuteman, this would make an excellent episode of Awful Archaeology. Anyways, okay, with that, buckle up, guys, because shit's about to get crazy. Hey guys, welcome to a rather impromptu Gideon Stuff adventure. Today we're going to be hiking to Sandia Cave. I happen to find myself in the Sandia Mountains because I like driving down back roads, and I've never been to this cave before, and I've always wanted to, so we're going to go ahead and do this hike real quick. The Sandia Mountains, just really quickly, I'm probably going to record a different section talking about the geology and history of the area, but the Sandia Mountains are primarily limestone, Paleozoic, passive marine margin sediments, my bad, and limestone, basically, which is great for forming caves because of carbonic erosion, or carbonic weathering, which is basically where carbonic acid dissolved calcite in the limestone and hollows it out to make these caves. And yeah, I'm kind of in a hurry. If you can't tell, it's getting late. It's going to get dark soon. So let's go ahead and not dilly-dally. And let's run up there. Just a half-mile walk to the cave, so this should be a pretty quick little adventure. It is beautiful out here. Oh my gosh, is it beautiful. The road we came in on, that road right there, that's New Mexico 165. It's the road that kind of traverses through the Sandia's dirt road, but a fairly nice dirt road. And here we can see lots and lots of limestone. Gotta keep my eye open for brachiopod fossils, coral fossils, crinoids, things like that. Ah, it's gorgeous back here. Absolutely gorgeous. It is a crisp January day. Kind of a weird winter for the area. Typically, I would expect there to be, you know, a good amount of snow back here. Right now, I'm actually not sure the elevation I'm at right now. Probably, judging by the plant life, probably about 7,000 feet right here. But yeah, been a very, very dry, warm winter. Definitely an El Nino winter, and also, you know, thanks climate change. But yeah, great trail, by the way. This is going to be a very fast walk. Nice big limestone wall right here. A little bit of slippery ice. You might be wondering why so many of the mountains I climb and places I go to in New Mexico in general are made out of limestone. Well, it's because New Mexico is very tectonically active, and a lot of these limestones were deposited about 300 million years ago during the Paleozoic. And because New Mexico is tectonically active, a lot of these rock units are being uplifted. When you uplift something, you expose the top layers to erosion. And so all the Mesozoic stuff has basically been eroded off. Not all of it, but in a lot of places. And this old stuff is what's left. And I talk too fast to hike. And there's the cave right over there. Got like a little thing built around it. And actually we can see other caves in the limestone too. Because again, limestone is great at making caves. Man, this limestone's just beautiful though. Look at that. This whole valley is gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. Whew. I'm still feeling the holidays. Goodness gracious. Probably put on 5 pounds going home to eat some of my mom's home cooking. Enough of the slop that I make myself. Whew. Delicious, but man, I ate too much, you know? Ah well, that's what the holidays are for, right? And there we go. Look at that. Sweet. And now we start ascending the stairs. Oh, look how beautiful that is out there. Those mountains way in the background, that's the Jemez. We've done a couple of videos out there. Oh man. Beautiful. Beautiful. Aha, what did I tell you? Look, crinoids. Oh, holy cow. That's a big old crinoid. Man, there's some beefy monsters in here. Here's some coral fossils. Holy cow, look at all those crinoids. Those are, oh wow, look at that one. Crinoid meadow used to be here 300 million years ago. Wow. Oh, is that some bryozoa? Sweet. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, this is magnificent, guys. Holy cow. Can't believe it took me this long to come here. This has been on my list forever. Up the spiral staircase and into the cave. Okay, so that took us about 10 minutes to get here from the trailhead, and that's with me stopping to film things like crinoids, and also being weighed down with tamales and pozole and bizcochitos and green hominy casserole I had for breakfast this morning. Oh, I'll tell you guys what, it's hard to stay thin when you're New Mexican. We've just got so many good things to eat. And so many sweet moms and abuelas to make it for us. Alright, let's go up. Alrighty, you guys ready for the reveal? Ta-da! Holy cow, how far back does it go? Only one way to find out. Oh. Lumos Maxima. Also, there's a little wall built here. Oh, wow. It keeps going. Should we? Trick question, of course we should. Let's step back in time about 85 years. It's May 6th, 1940, and Time magazine has just published an article that's about to set off 50 years of controversy. The article announces the discovery of an archaeological site in New Mexico that seemingly rewrites the story of the first New World cultures. The site was discovered by one Frank Hibben, a young, gifted professor of anthropology from the University of New Mexico. Between 1936 and 1940, Hibben and his team of students excavated a cave. But before we dive into the controversy surrounding this cave, let's get to know the man at the center of it all, Frank Hibben. And I think this is also a great time to mention that all of the sources I used for this video will be linked in the video description as always. Of particular importance, most of the background information that I got on Frank Hibben comes from an excellent 1995 article by Douglas Preston for The New Yorker. This article is incredible. It was an amazing expose, and it was kind of the centerpiece of all my research. All the stuff that I basically started with that article and then kind of went out from there gathering all my other sources. So big shout out to Douglas Preston. He's an absolute G. Great article. Again, it will be linked below if you want to read it. Also, quick word on The New Yorker. I signed up for their free trial, and they actually send you emails reminding you, hey, you're doing a free trial. It comes up at this time. If you don't want us to continue charging you, you should cancel before then. That's awesome. Not every website does that, so I really appreciate that. Shout out to The New Yorker. They got your back. Side note, Douglas Preston also wrote a series of novels about a character named Gideon, who's a professional thief and also a scientist at Los Alamos National Labs here in New Mexico. I just thought that was kind of funny. Frank Cumming... I'm a child. Frank Cumming Hibben was born on December 5th, 1910 in Lakewood, Ohio. Man, I'm glad we got through that sentence. He earned his bachelor's degree in archaeology from Princeton in 1933, received a master's degree in zoology from the University of New Mexico in 1936, and got a PhD in anthropology from Harvard in 1940. It's a pretty good resume. Most of Hibben's archaeological research was centered in New Mexico. He spent nearly his entire academic career at UNM, where he became a professor of anthropology, as well as the director of the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology. In addition to being a respected and accomplished scholar, Hibben was held in high regard by many of his peers, neighbors, students, and friends. He was known for being jovial, generous, and entertaining. Unlike the stereotype for folks in his field, Hibben was young, handsome, and outgoing. His students enjoyed being invited to parties thrown by him, and his classes were never boring. One former pupil recalled that Hibben would begin his hominin evolution lessons by, quote, grabbing the door jamb and swinging into the classroom like an ape and leap up on his desk and make ape-like sounds. He honestly sounds like a pretty awesome professor. But Frank Hibben was more than just a professor and an academic. He was a swashbuckling adventurer, a big game hunter, a television personality, and a war hero. In short, I am now stepping on the toes of another YouTuber, because Frank Hibben is an absolute mad lad. Hibben was born to, quote, a respectable family of modern means, close quote. He was preparing to go off to college when the Great Depression descended onto the country. He was an outstanding student and had been accepted to Harvard, but because of economic hardships, he chose to go to Princeton instead. Interestingly, his cousin, John Grier Hibben, was the president of the school at the time. Now, I'm not making any accusations of nepotism. Frank had clearly earned a place at any school of his choosing, but this does establish a pattern that we're going to see a lot through this video. Frank has a lot of connections, and he's very good at maneuvering through social mires. After graduating with a degree in archaeology, Hibben went west to study zoology at the University of New Mexico. Hibben first came to New Mexico while on an expedition to collect small birds and mammals for the Cleveland Museum. He fell in love with the archaeology of the area and decided to settle in the land of enchantment. He had good taste, at least. He wrote his master's thesis on mountain lions. Hibben kind of had a thing for large cats. I'm serious, you are going to be shocked at how often large cats pop up in this story. While surveying mountain lions for his thesis, he spent weeks on end bushwhacking through the wilds of New Mexico with none other than Ben Lilly. For those of you that don't know, Ben Lilly was a legendary outdoorsman known as the last true mountain man. Over the course of his storied life, he fought and killed bears using nothing but a knife, was a hunting guide for Theodore Roosevelt, and also worked for the U.S. Biological Survey. He sent hundreds of specimens to the Smithsonian, some of which are still on display, and also that included the largest grizzly bear ever killed in Arizona. Lilly spent much of his later years in the Gila Wilderness, a place near and dear to my heart, and he is credited with killing the last grizzly bear in the Gila. Come on, man. Ben Lilly was the perfect companion for studying mountain lions because he had a very special relationship with them. Not only did he kill about 1,000 of them, my goodness, but he was also very fond of cougar meat and believed that eating it would give him cat powers. And you know what? Maybe it did. Everyone who met him described him as 5 foot 9 inches of you and 180 pounds of invincible. He was also known to capture and raise mountain lion cubs, but he wouldn't keep them as pets. He would simply observe and learn from them. What a guy. I know this is a bit of a tangent, but I used to live in the Silver City area, and Ben Lilly is a legend over there. And I think giving some background on him is also important to illustrate the kind of man that Frank Hibben was. He was the kind of guy that could walk in stride with Ben Lilly. In closing, I want to share one Ben Lilly quote that I think is absolutely hilarious. While facing down a huge bear armed with nothing but his own custom-made Bowie knife, Ben yelled out, "You are condemned, you black devil! I kill you in the name of the law!" Seriously, one of these days, go down the Ben Lilly rabbit hole. Just read as much as you can about this guy. He's absolutely insane. Frank Hibben's adventures with big cats did not end at his master's thesis. As I mentioned before, he was an avid big game hunter and set several world records. His house in Albuquerque was full of his trophy kills, including one massive man-eating leopard that some claimed was the largest ever recorded. On one occasion, while on a hunt in Somalia, Hibben was attacked by a lion. Luckily, he was able to kill it and then mount his camel and ride 80 miles back to civilization. Oh, I forgot to mention that the lion broke Hibben's back. Of course, that lion ended up mounted on Hibben's wall. Hibben's zoological interest did not end at hunting, however. He was also involved in conservation. He won the Weatherby Hunting and Conservation Award in 1964, which kind of mixes the two interests, I guess. More importantly, however, he was chairman of the Albuquerque Zoological Board for more than a decade, the director of the Albuquerque Zoo in 1977, and the chairman of the New Mexico State Game and Fish Commission from 1961 to 1971. He was instrumental in introducing several exotic species to New Mexico, including oryx. The oryx is particularly special to me because I would see them all the time when I was doing field work out in the San Andres Mountains. And actually, fun fact, a couple months ago, one of my buddies shot and killed one. I helped him prepare the hide. He gave me some of the meat as payment, and I took it home and shared it with my family for the holidays. It was delicious. We made sausage and chorizo. Mwah. Like most men alive in the 1940s, Hibben served in World War II. He served in the Navy as a commissioned officer, and his service mostly involved espionage and strategy. He worked for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, where he was an aide to Admiral Foy. His main job was to memorize battle plans and take them to commanding officers in war theaters around the world. And yes, when I say memorize, I mean that he would carry these plans in his mind alone and relay them by memory to the war leaders he met with. Toward the end of the war, while on an important mission, a plane that Hibben was on was shot down by a German submarine. Hibben survived, obviously, but he was seriously wounded and carried shrapnel from the event in his body for the rest of his life. After the war, Hibben maintained connections with some very big names. Names like Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. You might have heard of those guys. In addition, Hibben claimed to continue running secret missions for the State Department after the war. According to Preston's article, Hibben, quote, would sometimes disappear for a week or two and come back looking jet-lagged and dropping hints about secret missions for the State Department or private meetings with such people as Henry Kissinger. I could only find details about one of these missions, which isn't surprising because government secrets and all, but I'll read that for you here directly from Preston's article. The conversation immediately turned to Roy Chapman Andrews, whose books on exploring in Mongolia we had both read in our youth. I traced some of Andrews' trails when I got to Outer Mongolia, Hibben said. I had an assignment from the U.S. government to go into Lop Nor. I was planning a device to monitor Chinese atomic tests at Lop Nor. I'm not sure this has been declassified. I hope so. My instructions were to get as close to Lop Nor as possible and leave it at a high point. On the pretext of a hunting trip, he explained, he flew into the Soviet-dominated part of Mongolia, carrying the device with him. In Kobdo, he gave his official interpreter the slip and met up with a Chinese Mongol who knew the Altai Mountains. They outfitted an expedition and went to the Altais by Bactrian camel. Working their way through the mountains, the two secretly crossed the Sino-Soviet border and rode several hundred miles into China, getting the device as close as they dared to Lop Nor. I put it on a butte and pulled up the antenna. A red light went on, Hibben said. I was pretty glad to get rid of it. As they headed back to the Soviet border, he said, he and his guide were attacked by a Chinese patrol on camels. We came out from behind this ridge. They were 400 or 500 yards from us, and they were cutting us off. They began to shoot, and we could see the bullets kicking up the dust. They cut in behind us and stopped, and then my camel began to show signs of distress. They had shot him through the stomach. He fell and his shoulder pinned my foot and hurt it. I got on the baggage camel, and we straggled back, and we traveled all that night. This guy is nuts. What a life. Alrighty, day 2 of filming. I specifically put on the same hoodie and the same cap so that you guys wouldn't know that there was a gap in filming, but then I immediately go and spoil the illusion. What can I say? I'm not a smart man. Hibben was very popular within New Mexican circles. Newspapers loved writing about him and his adventures, and he soon became known as one of the greatest lecturers in UNM history. He was close friends with many powerful and influential people, including a former governor. With connections like these comes a degree of invincibility. Those who did not love Hibben feared him. On one occasion, a state employee denied Hibben's request to renew an excavating permit. Soon after, that employee was treated to a special phone call from the lieutenant governor. Needless to say, Hibben got his permit renewed. New Mexico. I love this state, but boy oh boy do we have a long problem with government corruption. Hibben was also the author of many books, some on anthropology and some about hunting. His books mainly focused on two places, New Mexico and Africa. Hibben participated in several archaeological expeditions to Africa in addition to his many hunting trips. He even worked with Louis and Mary Leakey on several occasions. For those of you who don't know, Louis and Mary Leakey were a duo of archaeologists that made some of the greatest anthropological discoveries in history. Probably the most famous of these is the Laetoli footprints, which Mary found. Hibben had such a knowledge and a love for Africa that his personal friend, Richard Nixon, offered to make him the Undersecretary of African Affairs in the 1970s. Yes, that's right. Hibben's web of connections went all the way to one of the most powerful men on the planet. And if you're thinking to yourself, holy crap, this guy cannot possibly have more power than this, you would be dead wrong, because Frank Hibben was also filthy rich. But you might remember I said that he was born into modest means. So how did he become rich? Well, he married into it. And he did it in the most Frank Hibben way possible. When Hibben first came to New Mexico, he made the acquaintance of an older couple named Arthur and Eleanor Pack. The two, quote, lavished attention on him. At the time, Arthur was the guy running Nature magazine, so you can see why Hibben's adventures and endeavors in conservation attracted the older man's attention. The Packs also owned a piece of land in New Mexico called Ghost Ranch. Ghost Ranch is up in my neck of the woods and is world famous for Georgia O'Keeffe paintings and, more importantly, in my opinion, for preserving one of the greatest Triassic fossil assemblages in the world. This is the site of the famous Coelophysis bone bed, which has yielded thousands of specimens of New Mexico's state fossil. And by the way, New Mexico is one of the coolest state fossils, in case you were wondering. Anyway, Hibben lived with the Packs at Ghost Ranch for quite some time. The Packs financed a lot of Hibben's shenanigans. According to one archaeologist who knew the Packs and Hibben, quote, Arthur Pack grub-staked Frank. He financed Frank's work on mountain lions. While Hibben was prowling around that part of the world, he kept stumbling over Indian ruins, and they kind of fascinated him. Arthur Pack's wife, Brownie, also fascinated him. In the business, we call this foreshadowing. So what happened next, you can probably already put together for yourself, but I'm going to read it directly from Preston's article because he put it very succinctly. One day he, Arthur, came home and found his wife gone, having run away with a student who was 12 years her junior. She had left a note that, Pack wrote, brought my world crashing down about me. She and Hibben were married on June 5th, 1936, and to the marriage she brought a large amount of money and 2 stepdaughters. Hibben invested their money with remarkable shrewdness over the years, and they built up a considerable fortune, even as they lived extravagantly and traveled around the world. Hibben really had a thing for cougars. And to round things out on the background of Frank Hibben, he was also known for being an entertaining TV personality. Because of course he is. This guy's done like literally everything. This guy is there anything he hasn't done? Oh my gosh. He appeared on numerous television shows, including What's My Line and To Tell the Truth, and was featured in a 28-part ABC television series called On Safari with Frank Hibben. And as of the time of recording, I have not been able to find any clips of any of these shows, so I don't know if they're any good or not. If I find some clips, I'll see if I can insert them here without getting copyright struck, but yeah. So that's Frank Hibben, the man who put Sandia Cave on the map. Now let's go ahead and talk about the cave, and also Sandia Man. Okay, so the first thing we need to discuss is the stratigraphy and archaeology of the cave itself to put everything into context. Archaeological context is very, very important. If an artifact is found out of context, if it's found out of its original environment, if it's not in situ, then it loses like 99% of any data that makes it valuable as a scientific artifact. So it's very important that when you find an artifact, You take careful notes about everything around it. You make sure you know stratigraphy, the layer that you found it in, because that is going to tell you potentially a lot more than the artifact itself will. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through the stratigraphy of the cave. I'm not doing any retakes on that. You can put up with my stuttering. All right, so remember, the cave was excavated between 1936 and 1940. And during that time, Hibben published a couple different reports about the stratigraphy and archaeology of the cave. I'm going to sum that up for you a little bit right here. On the very top layer, Hibben's team recovered artifacts of the modern age, mostly pottery identified as dating from the Pueblo III through 5 periods, or from about 1150 CE to the present. The uppermost layer was also comprised of bat guano and pack rat nests. The next layer lay immediately under this one. It was a thick layer of calcium carbonate, forming an unbroken crust over the lower layers, according to Hibben. Of course, calcium carbonate, also known as the mineral calcite, is abundant in limestone cave systems. Limestone itself is nearly entirely composed of calcite. It is actually because of this mineral that limestone caves are so common. Limestone is susceptible to carbonation erosion, a process where water eats away at the rock and dissolves the calcite. Here's how that works. Oh yeah, that's right. We're getting the whiteboard out. So the first thing we need to know is that in the atmosphere, water molecules mix with carbon dioxide molecules to form an acid called carbonic acid, which looks a little something like that. You see how these two things added together equals that? Awesome. That's chemistry. Eventually, this solution falls out of the atmosphere and to the earth, and we call that acid rain because it's not water anymore, it's acid. Sometimes this acid rain falls onto limestone rocks, which again are made primarily of the mineral calcite, which is calcium carbonate, which is this stuff right here. The acid starts to dissolve the calcium carbonate, and they mix and they form a solution called calcium bicarbonate, which only exists as an aqueous solution, which is then kind of washed away. But remember this because it's very, very important. And by the way, in case you can't read my handwriting, this is CaHCO3 2. Sometimes I can't even read my own handwriting, so that's important. Anyways, this process basically takes the rock apart on a chemical level, and so you start opening up holes and cavities in this rock, and that's where we get sinkholes and caves and karsts and all kinds of wonderful, lovely things like that. Okay, so remember our calcium bicarbonate? Awesome. I told you that'd be important later. So now we have these puddles of calcium bicarbonate that are sitting at the bottom of these holes that have been eroded into the limestone. Well, it gets pretty hot in limestone caves. They can be quite humid environments, and that causes some evaporation. And so the water leaves this solution. The H2O just evaporates and escapes the atmosphere as a gas. Well, what does that leave you? That leaves you with calcium carbonate again. So you've gone from a liquid solution to now solid calcite. And we sometimes call this travertine when it's coating the bottom of a cave or deposited by a hydrothermal event. And in case you were curious, I've actually got a chunk of travertine right here. This is very similar to the travertine that would have been present in Sandia cave. You can actually see different layers through here. Maybe. Actually, that light's way too bright. Yeah, can you see that? Those different layers. So that's basically just subsequent episodes of travertine deposition. And I also have just a very nice calcite crystal here. Look at that. That's beautiful. Isn't that gorgeous? Kind of hard to show off right here with my light, but there's a calcite crystal for you. So in this way, we can see a really neat calcium carbonate cycle that goes on in these limestone caves. Speaking of cool, carbonation or weathering actually happens at a greater rate in colder environments. I'm going to kind of gloss over this because I don't want to give an entire isotope geochemistry lesson, but basically, colder water can hold more dissolved CO2, thus creating a more potent acid. And I bring this up because Hibben concluded that the travertine layer in Sandia Cave had to have been deposited after a wet season shortly before the end of the Pleistocene. AKA, this layer was deposited about 11,700 years ago at the end of the last glacial maximum. Increased rainfall, mixed with a colder climate, would have led to more calcium carbonate erosion, which would have led to an increase in deposition of travertine. At least I assume this was Hibben's reasoning. In all the papers of his that I read, he just kind of asserts that the travertine was deposited at the end of the Pleistocene without providing any further explanation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This travertine crust is probably the most important layer in the cave, which is why I'm giving it so much attention. Everything else I'm about to say hinges on the fact that this travertine crust was supposedly unbroken and undisturbed over the entire floor of the cave. This crust is an archaeologist's wet dream. Essentially, it has created a time capsule. Everything under this crust should be undisturbed, in place, and protected from the elements. It should all be in its correct context. I cannot stress enough how important the sentence I just said is. Hibben and his team broke through the travertine crust with sledgehammers and picks. Under this, they found our third layer of interest, which Hibben called the Folsom occupation. This horizon contained artifacts of the Folsom culture. Folsom culture is the term used to describe the archaeological remains of Paleo-Indian groups living in North America between about 10,800 BCE and 10,200 BCE, named for Folsom, New Mexico, where one of the first sites was recognized. Like other Paleo-Indigenous traditions, the Folsom culture is characterized primarily by the types of stone projectile heads they made. There is so much awesome anthropology and history surrounding the Folsom culture and their discovery, but I don't want this video to be 5 hours long. The main takeaway is that this discovery showed that Sandia Cave was inhabited by humans as far back as 10,800 years ago. Under the Folsom layer was a layer of limonite dust, or ochre as it's more commonly called in older writings. Limonite is not a mineral, despite its name. It's actually a weathering product made primarily of iron oxides and hydroxides. Here's some limonite right here. It's pretty common, kind of ugly, and not something I usually ever think twice about, but it becomes very, very important to the story, so do not forget this limonite layer. Hibben interpreted this yellowish-orange layer of ochre to represent another wet phase. Okay, now things are about to get very interesting. Underneath the limonite layer is our final and most controversial layer, the Sandia layer. I know, Hibben is just cooking with these names. In this layer, Hibben claimed to have found human artifacts dating back to 25,000 years ago, including a new style of spear point never seen in the Americas before. And that's all I'm going to say about this layer right now. We'll be coming back to it, I assure you of that. But just for some context, before Hibben announced this discovery, the oldest evidence of people in the Americas was the Clovis culture. And at the time, pushing them back to about 13,500 years ago was kind of the upper end of the estimate for how long people had been in the Americas. So yeah, this 25,000 years number is absolutely bonkers. But now that I've given you my breakdown of these layers, I want you to hear their description from Hibben himself. I'm going to be reading from a 1961 paper he published through the New Mexico Geologic Survey. So for context, this is 21 years after his discovery was announced, and he was the sole author of this paper. We'll be kind of coming back to that. Quote, "The findings in Sandia Cave are of major importance. The cave fill was stratified with definite cultural objects in various strata, some of which can be identified as paralleling certain other known culture horizons. In the mouth of the cave, modern material was present in the form of potsherds. These are of black and white types of the Pueblo III period and late glazewares, such as occur at Pueblo IV and Pueblo V sites in the Rio Grande Valley and in the Gallesto district. Other recent accumulation was represented by deposits of guano and pack rat debris, diminishing towards the rear of the cave. Beneath this modern deposit extended a sheet of cave travertine, or calcium carbonate, representing a wet period preceding the recent. This calcium carbonate crust seems to represent the end of the Pleistocene. Beneath this cave crust lies the uppermost of the two main cultural horizons. This one is termed the Folsom occupation because of included artifacts. It is characterized by loose debris cemented into a breccia by calcium-charged waters percolating from above. Below the Folsom floor is a sterile laminated stratum of yellow ochre, representing another and earlier wet phase. Below the yellow ochre is a Sandia layer, the earliest cultural stratum of the site. The Sandia layer is less consolidated than a Folsom and contains fire areas or hearths. Below the Sandia occupation, between the Sandia and bedrock, lies an intermittent layer of disintegrated limestone of clay-like consistency. The cave also had the remains of several animals in it. These critters are not all that important to the story right now, but they will come back up. I'm going to read again from Hibben's NMGS paper. 12 species of animals are present in all the strata of Sandia Cave. In the recent layer, only the ground sloth is an extinct member. Sloth remains were found only in the lowermost portions of the recent deposit and in the rear of the cave. The Folsom layer is distinguished by horse, camel, bison, mammoth, ground sloth, and wolf. The Sandia stratum includes in its faunal assemblage horse, bison, camel, mastodon, and mammoth. The paleontological grouping of Sandia Cave is chiefly valuable as contributing to the knowledge of late Pleistocene and early recent times. None of the species is particularly distinctive, nor are the associations new. The sloth is again indicated as one of the last survivors of the many large Pleistocene mammals which became extinct at the end of that period and in the beginning of the recent.
Now, I'm no expert, but this wall does not look like it was built by Native Americans. And I don't think it was built by Greg either. And actually, look, there's some wire, so yeah, this was not built by Native Americans. Never mind. I should have seen that sooner. Sock. Lovely. A santuario. Huh. Oh, it keeps going. Well, let's see how far we can get down that way. Well, still going. The air back here is getting a little bit tasty. So we'll see how much further I decide to go. Huh. Calcite crystals. Huh. Wow. And it ain't over yet. Holy moly. This is wild. Trash, of course. Can't get away from that. Victorian Nick. Yeehaw. Oh, still going. Looks like it forks there. Huh. Let's go see. This is incredible. good to not be hunched over anymore. And it's still going. Holy smokes. I had no idea it was this extensive. It's pretty badass. Well, guys, I think this is the end of the road, for today at least. I see a wall back there, and the cave might go that way, but I don't have much more time to mess around here today, so we're going to leave that to be a mystery for another day. And now, we get to climb out of here. Let me turn off the light real quick just so you can see how dark it is. Pitch black. Can't see anything. Except for my phone screen right now, but pretty sweet. Pretty sweet. As far as potential dangers go, there's not a whole lot here. The cave is fairly straight, so I don't think you're going to get lost. And judging by how many people come here, the wild animals probably don't like this place. I do think I saw a rat back there. He ducked outside before I could be sure, but there are some ancient rat droppings in here. Still, though, I didn't see any bats, and yeah, this place gets visited quite a bit. Oh, shit! Mad Max was here. Hell yeah. There she is. The light at the end of the tunnel. Holy cow. That was echoey. Now that's pretty iconic. And it's windy out there. And you know something? These limestone caves, whew, they can get pretty warm. That cold mountain air is definitely going to feel great. I was right. That mountain air feels perfect. Yet. Look how orange my hand is from the crawling around in the dirt in there. I have small orange hands. You guys know who that makes me, right? I'm gonna make America great again. It's gonna be huge. This hike was huge. Great day for America. Not as huge as I'm gonna make this country, but pretty huge. In fact, look at this. I look like I just jumped in a bowl of Cheetos. Smells like sour dust. Let's get back to the truck. What do you guys think? You know what? I think I'll give you guys a little POV of going down the stairs here. Oh! Definitely don't want to trip. Luckily, they gave you this nice big guardrail, or should I say, they give you this nice huge guardrail. You're not gonna fall, ever, never gonna fall. It's impossible. And there we go. Man, solid little adventure, a mini adventure, but a good one.
Alrighty, let's start dissecting this discovery with a little more detail. Remember that bottommost layer, the Sandia layer? In that layer, Hibben reported the discovery of 19 spear points that represented a group of people living in the cave about 25,000 years ago. This would make this culture the oldest known group of North Americans, many thousands of years older than the Folsom culture. This culture soon became known as the Sandia man. The travertine crust covering the strata of the cave promised artifacts that were untouched and perfectly preserved in context. The first announcement of this site caused immediate and widespread excitement throughout the archaeological community. Archaeologists and anthropologists from all over the world were eager to explore the secrets hidden in this mysterious cave. Sandia man was a big game hunter. The cave was littered with animal bones, spear points, hide scrapers, and the remains of fire pits. Obviously, this cave was some sort of kill site, if not a permanent dwelling. Of particular interest were the 19 spear points. They were unlike any seen in the Americas before, but not completely new. Points actually resembled a type of spearhead from Europe. These spearheads, called Solutrean points, are distinct from Folsom and Clovis points. Solutrean points are found mainly in France and Spain and date to about 22,000 years ago. Well, this prompts an interesting question. What on earth are prehistoric European-style artifacts doing in the Americas? The peopling of the Americas is a topic of hot debate, even today. How did people get here? There have been a lot of theories proposed over the years. Since the times of first contact between Old World colonizers and the New World, people have been struggling to figure out how humans got to this mysterious continent. A popular early hypothesis was that Native Americans were descended from the lost tribes of Israel. Currently, there is no widely accepted theory explaining how humans came to the Americas, but most anthropologists agree that early Americans migrated here from Asia. Genetics, linguistics, and the archaeological records support this idea, but the exact timing of this migration and how it happened are in contention. For many years, it was thought that the Clovis culture represented the oldest humans in North America, and that they came from Asia via a land bridge shortly after the last glacial maximum, around 13,500 years ago. It is now clear that humans have been in the Americas since before the last glacial maximum, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, now it's time to discuss the Solutrean Hypothesis. The Solutrean Hypothesis describes the idea that the Americas were first populated by humans migrating across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe. This would have had to have happened around 21,000 years ago. Probably before then, but not much later. The first evidence for this theory came from similarities between Clovis points and Solutrean points, mainly the fact that both styles feature bifacial geometry and are created with an overshot flaking technique. Clovis points differ from Solutrean points, however, by possessing bifacial fluting. It's this groove on the bottom of both sides of the point for attaching it to a spear. Proponents of the Solutrean hypothesis argue that the Clovis culture is an evolution of the Solutrean culture. The hypothesis requires that people from Europe travel to the Americas either by boat or by traversing a huge ice bridge between the continents. A handful of lithic points found on the east coast, especially this one from Chesapeake Bay, are cited as evidence for this migration. But this hypothesis has some major issues. For one, the similarities in the way that Clovis and Solutrean points are made is not all that compelling. There's only so many ways to flake a stone into a spearhead, and it's very possible that two groups would discover a similar method independently. And, just look at these points. They're pretty different in design and style. And speaking of style, the Solutreans are known to have created art, namely cave paintings and carvings. This style of art is completely absent from Clovis sites. And what about those East Coast artifacts? Well, the most famous one was dredged up from the bottom of Chesapeake Bay and is difficult to put into context. The others most closely resemble later styles of Native American points from about 5,000 years ago. Most of these artifacts are found in places where they are out of context. Carbon dating has been done on objects near and around several of these points, and some of these dates actually predate the Solutrean culture. This is probably because the artifacts are out of context, but even so, wouldn't this at least prompt some folks to suggest that maybe the Solutreans were descended from Native Americans? No. No one would ever say that. Mostly because it would be incorrect and not supported by the data, but also for some more sinister reasons. So the Solutrean hypothesis was kind of codified and fleshed out in 2002, but the ideas behind the Solutrean hypothesis go back hundreds and hundreds of years. They go all the way back to Darwin. You see, back in the early days of archaeology, there was this idea of the superiority of the white race. I know, shocking. Racism hundreds of years ago. But this theory led a lot of anthropologists to speculate that only white men had what it took to create lasting and successful cultures. And so every culture around the world that was successful and did crazy things had to, in some way, been related to the Europeans. Now, this scientific racism is obviously wrong and incorrect, but from the time when we first became aware that evolution was a thing, some European thinkers tried to argue that some humans were less than others based on scientific data, head measuring and stuff like that. A lot of European scientists considered Aboriginal peoples to be a separate species, or multiple separate species from the white man. So you can see where a lot of problematic thinking was going on. Obviously, today we know this is all bullshit. When you get down to the DNA level, we are all the same. But It was a pretty popular idea for a long time, and in the 1930s, archaeologists in the Americas were actively looking for evidence to prove that Native Americans were related to Europeans. I'm going to read from Preston's article again. It was almost too good to be true, for the archaeological community had been eagerly hoping for two discoveries: a pre-Folsom people and a connection to the old world, and Sandia Cave provided both. Now, there are still some people today who are proponents of the Solutrean Hypothesis, and I'm not saying that they're all racist. I don't think the modern Solutrean Hypothesis was born out of hate. I think it's a genuine attempt to address some data, but it kind of falls flat. And let's go ahead and explore some more of the reasons why that is. In addition to the kind of loose connections between the Clovis culture and the Solutrean culture, there's no evidence that any Solutrean groups had seafaring experience. There's no boat remnants or evidence of large coastal communities. Climate research reveals that there probably wasn't a continuous ice sheet between Europe and America 21,000 years ago. Instead, there would have been a seasonal iceberg field. That seems like the wrong word. An expanse of icebergs drifting on the ocean. Anyways, this iceberg field, this bunch of icebergs, would have actually been carried by ocean currents to the southeast, away from the Americas. So it's not like the Solutreans could ride icebergs to the Americas. They would have had to hop from berg to berg to berg, which is possible, but even if the Solutreans decide to iceberg hop all the way across an ocean, we have no evidence that they were particularly fond of icy conditions. It seems the Solutreans prefer to stay in the warmer parts of southern Europe. So all of this is pretty damning, but you can argue about it, this way or that. But proponents of the Solutrean Hypothesis have one more trick up their sleeve. Genetics. Okay, remember, I'm a geologist, rock man, not a geneticist, but I have taken 4 college-level biology courses, so I'm going to attempt to stumble my way through this. When we trace the genetics of various Native American groups, we find 5 main haplogroups. That's a weird word. What's a haplogroup? A haplogroup is a collection of haplotypes. What's a haplotype? A haplotype is a collection of inherited alleles passed down from a common ancestor. And if you remember high school biology, alleles are different versions of genes. Essentially, a haplogroup preserves evidence of a mutation in an organism that can be seen in its distant descendants. Haplogroups are traced through mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. This is important because, well, just like everything in genetics, it shows how 2 organisms are related. Okay, here we are now in the parking lot at my work talking about genetics. Guys, if you don't ever learn anything else from this channel, learn this. If you already have a life that's very, very busy, do not add YouTube video essays to your list of things to do, because it's not going to pay off, especially if YouTube doesn't pay your bills. It's just a dumb thing to do. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and keep talking about haplogroups. 4 of the 5 Native American haplogroups can be linked to ancestors of Asian origin. The 5th one, X2A, is where things get interesting. Haplogroup X is present in Europe and is especially concentrated in places like northern Scotland. Could this be because Solutrean explorers settled in Scotland before going to America? Probably not. Spoiler alert, but I'm sorry. So right off the bat, we have never sequenced any Solutrean DNA. That's right. We don't actually know if haplogroup X was present in these people. Second, haplogroup X is comprised of multiple clades. They share a common ancestor way back because, like all people are related once you go far enough back. But these clades are not ancestral to one another. Peoples of Northern Europe and the Near East carry haplogroups X2b, X2c, and X2d. Native Americans carry X2a and X2g. In addition, the earliest Native Americans found who carried haplogroup X2a, the Kennewick man, was from northern Washington instead of the East Coast, like you would expect if they came from Europe. So I think it's pretty clear to say that today, the Solutrean Hypothesis just isn't the best explanation for the data we have. But back in 1930, when Frank Hibben announced that he discovered proof that the earliest Americans were descended from Europeans, it caused waves. Many archaeologists at the time were specifically looking for this kind of data because they already believed that a successful group of humans had to have come from Europe. And there we go, we get back around to the racism thing. However, on that note, I'm not saying that Frank Hibben used the Sandia site to propagate racist ideals, but he may have used it to fraudulently propagate a theory he subscribed to. Let's go ahead and get into the weeds on that word I just used, fraudulently. The discoveries in Sandia Cave led to the birth of Sandia Man, the oldest culture in the Americas. This cave suddenly became one of the most important archaeological sites on the continent. Though UNM was already a well-respected archaeological powerhouse, it became the archaeological institution after this find. Sandia Man soon started appearing in textbooks, and it was widely regarded as a fact that the Sandia culture was the oldest group of humans in North America. This site was considered so important that in the 1960s it was made a National Historic Landmark. I was kind of confused about why this tiny little cave had a really nice trail leading up to it with a nice spiral staircase going to the metal cage leading into the cave. I was kind of confused why someone would go through all that effort for an otherwise unspectacular cave that seems to nowadays just be used as a makeout spot for teenagers. Well, this is why. Because back in the day, it was designated a National Historic Landmark, so money was actually thrown at preserving this cave and making it accessible to the public. But not all was as it seemed. You see, as time went by, people started noticing little inconsistencies with the artifacts taken from the cave, and they started investigating. The first person to blow a whistle was a man named Wesley L. Bliss. In 1940, he published a paper in American Antiquity entitled A Chronological Problem Presented by Sandia Cave, New Mexico. This paper made a startling claim. The stratigraphic layers of the cave were bioturbated. Bioturbation is just fancy speak for animal burrowing. In this case, Bliss was claiming that the layers of Sandia Cave had been tunneled through by pack rats. This is a massive problem for archaeologists because bioturbation mixes up the contents of a site. An artifact originally at layer 1 could be dragged down to layer 4. A bone shard at layer 3 could be carried all the way up to the surface. This destroys in situ context of an artifact and makes it very hard to reconstruct an accurate picture of the past. This revelation should have set off alarms for the findings at Sandia Cave. If the layers had been disturbed, how can anyone be sure of the ordering of the artifacts? More importantly, this completely flies in the face of the previous claim of a travertine crust over the entire cave floor. However, retribution was swift, and soon Hibben's powerful friends came to defend his honor. Dr. Donald B. Brand, the head of UNM's anthropology department, wrote a strongly worded letter to American Antiquity bashing Bliss and declaring that the travertine crust remained unbroken and undisturbed until Hibben began his excavations. At this point, you may be wondering, well, who is this Wesley Bliss fellow? How did he get this information? Well, in the 1930s, he was a UNM graduate assistant who worked under Hibben to excavate the cave. Interestingly, in the foreword for a 1941 publication for the Smithsonian, Hibben provides a lengthy list of student workers whom he thanks for their service. Bliss is not named. In fact, after Bliss responded to Brand, Hibben denied ever working with Bliss. In reality, it was Bliss who actually first started excavations at Sandia Cave. In fact, he and another graduate student would often take undergrads out to Sandia Cave and another nearby cave called Davis Cave, which we saw when I was out there, and they would do some digging and just kind of mess around. At the time, the caves held little value and only a few Puebloan artifacts had been found from either one. Obviously, no one took the caves all that seriously. If they had, UNM would have put a professor in charge of excavating them. And in case you need further evidence that Bliss was actually the one out there and actually did have involvement in the caves, unlike what Hibben says, in October of 1935, Hibben, Bliss and 3 others filed for a mining claim together so that they could dig in the caves. And that was a common practice in archaeology back in the day, was you'd file a mining claim over an area where you thought you had a site, and that would basically give you the permission to dig at that site. So yeah, despite what Hibben says, he definitely worked with Bliss at Sandia Cave. But then, at the end of the 1936 field season, Hibben took over. It was quite literally a hostile takeover. Bliss arrived in the cave one day and found Hibben waiting for him. Hibben promptly informed Bliss that he was now running things around here. Remember, in the summer of 1936, Hibben had just finished his master's degree. He was 26 years old, and although he was superior to Bliss, he didn't really have that much weight to throw around. But he had just married Eleanor, and he was already making a name for himself as a gifted and clever young archaeologist. People already loved him, so he had a lot of money at the time and a lot of admiration. It's likely he had backing from his connections in the department, and so any argument from Bliss would have been in vain. Still, because he had been one of the first guys in the caves, he was given his pick of which cave he wanted to continue working on. He chose Davis Cave because, at the time, it had actually produced more artifacts and seemed more promising than Sandia Cave. However, Davis Cave proved to be sterile. After Davis Cave proved to be sterile, Bliss would later go back to working in Sandia Cave. Interestingly, the first Sandia point was found while Bliss was at Sandia Cave, although the biggest finds came after he'd left. Regardless, Bliss's early objections to Hibben's finds were quickly forgotten. But in the 50s, another series of events cast some doubt over Sandia Cave. In the late 1940s, radiocarbon dating was developed. This would forever change archaeology. No more was stratigraphy the only way to date artifacts. Now, absolute ages could be obtained from the objects themselves. Hibben was obviously excited to send artifacts from Sandia Cave to a lab for carbon dating. If relics from the cave came back with ages older than 14,000 years, that would be huge, almost irrefutable evidence that Sandia man was indeed the earliest known American. So, in 1951 or 52, Hibben sent some bone and ivory fragments from Sandia Cave to the laboratory at the University of Michigan. For those of you who don't know, radiocarbon dating is a radiometric dating method that uses the carbon-14 isotope. An isotope is a variant of a chemical element. In the case of carbon, carbon has 14 isotopes numbered 8 through 20. This number refers to the mass of the isotope. Each isotope has the same number of protons. In the case of carbon, that is 6. And yes, the whiteboard is coming back out again, guys. 6 is the atomic number for carbon, but the different isotopes have varying numbers of neutrons. So in the case of carbon-14, it has 6 protons plus 8 neutrons, giving it a mass of 14. An isotope becomes unstable when it has too much excess energy caused by having too many protons or neutrons. This energy can do a few things, one of them involving the release of gamma radiation. But the only one that we care about right now is radioactive decay. Radioactive decay happens when all that excess energy releases a new particle from the nucleus of the atom, either an alpha particle or a beta particle. This process changes the nuclide, sometimes to another radioactive isotope, which undergoes the same process again, or a stable isotope that hangs around forever. In short, over time, the original radioactive atoms will decay into what we call daughter products. The amount of time it takes for half of a collection of parent atoms to decay into daughter product atoms is called a half-life and represents the decay rate of that isotope. We can measure the ratio of parent material to daughter product in a sample and then plug this ratio into an equation with the element's decay rate to find an age for the sample. Carbon-14 is very special because it's the longest-lived radioisotope of carbon, and it's the only one found in nature. Carbon-14 is formed when energy from cosmic cosmic rays forms neutrons that hit nitrogen particles in our atmosphere. And this collision forms something that looks a little bit like this. So you can see here, Slamming this neutron knocks off a proton from the nitrogen, and because we're losing a proton, that bumps us down to a carbon. This carbon-14 bonds with oxygen in the atmosphere to form carbon dioxide, and then gets dispersed all over the Earth, all throughout the atmosphere and the biosphere. We already talked about how CO2 gets into rainwater and stuff, but eventually this carbon dioxide gets into the soil, the water, and in this way it's absorbed by plants, and then it's transferred to animals that eat those plants, and then animals that eat those plants also consume that same carbon. And so in this way, terrestrial animals have the same ratio, and they have the same concentrations of C14 in their bodies as the atmosphere, and marine animals have the same ratio of C14 in their bodies as the water around them. And actually, like, as I'm thinking about too, there's other ways that organisms can absorb this carbon, and not just from eating things. Like, they can also get it directly from the atmosphere or the water, whatever it is they're living in. Anyways, there's another carbon isotope that we need to care about, and that is C12. This is a stable carbon isotope, and because all life on Earth is carbon-based, organisms have a whole bunch of this stuff in their bodies. So basically, all organisms have a set ratio of C14 to C12 in their bodies. And throughout an organism's life, the C14, because it is radioactive, is decaying, and it's leaving, right? It's decaying to nitrogen. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. It's decaying to nitrogen and being expelled from the body, basically. So yes, that means that you are radioactive. You are decaying as we speak right now. But the concentration of the C14 doesn't really change that much throughout the organism's life, because the organism is constantly recharging this reservoir by eating things, by just existing. So this ratio will always stay the same while the animal or plant is alive. However, once an organism dies, it stops bringing new carbon-14 into itself from its environment. And so all the carbon-14 that it had in its body, when it died, starts to decay to nitrogen, and it is not replaced. All right, let's do a little more chemistry, and let's talk about how exactly that carbon-14 changes to nitrogen-14 via radioactive decay. So here's the equation that describes what's happening, and I know it kind of looks a little scary. It's really not. It's very simple. I'm going to use some big words, but it's still very simple. So we start with this unstable carbon-14 isotope. As it decays, it emits a beta particle, or an electron. And remember, electrons have a negative charge. And it also emits an electron antineutrino. This isn't really that important. These things just kind of come together as a package deal. But anyways, the carbon has basically just ejected a negative charge. And because of that, one of the neutrons in the nucleus of the carbon changes to a proton. And what happens when you change the protons? You change your element. So this 6 changing to a 7 takes us from a carbon to a nitrogen. And that just happened because this lost a negative charge. Not that bad, right? Anyways, remember how in all organisms we have a ratio of C14 to C12. Well, over time, the C12 doesn't change. It's a stable isotope. It just is. However, the concentration of C14 starts to decrease. And over time, when we look at this change, this ratio of I have no idea what that was supposed to be. Anyways, we can look at the ratio of C14 to C12, and we can figure out how old an organism, how long ago an organism died, essentially.
Anyway, Hibben sent some Sandia cave bones to be tested. There were problems immediately. At that time, the United States decided to bomb the shit out of Bikini Atoll. A radioactive cloud from the blast drifted over Michigan, throwing the test results in the trash. Remember, this is the earliest days of using carbon dating, so it's a very expensive and time-consuming process to just go to waste. So the samples were tried again. The technicians eventually got results back on the mammoth tusk. It came back with a date older than 20,000 years. Bam! Sandia man validated. Game over!
and the press ate it up, because of course they did. Time ran another article and quoted Hibben as saying that there was, quote, incontrovertible proof that man had been in the Americas 20,000 years ago. Hibben also published these findings in Science and claimed that these results confirmed dates he obtained from earlier tests. Wait, what earlier tests? Well, Hibben said that in 1948, he and another researcher independently got other artifacts from Sandia Cave carbon dated. Quote, in 1948, 2 specimens of charcoal from the fire hearths of the Sandia level of Sandia Cave were submitted by Kirk Bryan of Harvard University to the University of Chicago for C14 dating. From these 2 samples, tentative dates of 17,000 plus years ago and 20,000 plus years ago, respectively, were derived. Bryan was emphatic that these dates should not be published at the time because of the inadequacy of the samples and possibility of a considerable error. That's pretty remarkable. And also probably, most definitely, 100% a lie. That's right, I said the L word. See, there was only one radiocarbon dating lab in the entire world before 1951, and it was at the University of Chicago. They had no record of Kirk Bryan ever submitting any material from Sandia Cave for testing. Further light could be shed on this mystery if Mr. Preston, or anybody else, had ever asked Dr. Bryan for his side of the story. But Bryan died in 1950, 5 years before Hibben made this claim. Folks smelled a fish as soon as the 1955 Science article came out. The lack of records from Chicago were further supported when no one could find any mention of these Sandia Cave artifacts in any of Bryan's writings. Don't forget Kirk Bryan, we'll be coming back to him very shortly. Hibben was quick to recover though, backtracking in a rather vague and politically savvy way. Quote, in regard to the 2 samples of charcoal from Sandia Cave collected by the late Kirk Bryan, there has been a dearth of evidence as to where and how Bryan dated these samples. I am in agreement that these dates should be removed from the record. He added that this did not invalidate the dates determined from mammoth ivory from Sandia Cave. Yeah, okay, buddy. It was too late. Hibben had messed up. And this little oopsie led some folks to dig deeper. And soon, even doubt was cast on the mammoth ivory. One of the first scientists to speak up was James Hester, the state archaeologist of Colorado. And holy cow, guys, it gets way too dark, way too quick in January. Urgh! But bear with me. Anyways, in 1952, Hester was a UNM undergrad working for Hibben. And what did Hibben have his undergraduates doing at the time? Packing and shipping samples. And, in one case, James Heston was put in charge of packing up Sandia Cave materials to send to Michigan. In particular, Heston remembered a little bit of mammoth tusk that he was asked to pack up. When I was working as his museum assistant, he told me that he wanted me to ship some tusk fragments he had in a cigar box. The next day, Hester said, when I came back into the lab, I saw that yellow ochre had been sprinkled all over them. Why the yellow ochre dirt? Oh, right! Because that's like the defining feature of Sandia Cave. Hester was confused, but being at that time, something like 20 years old, I decided the least controversial way to handle this was to just wash all the yellow ochre off and mail it. It seems to me that he got a date of about 20,000. So yeah, this was probably the tusk material that was dated by Michigan to get that famous 20,000 years date. Another time, Hibben asked Hester to mail some horse teeth from Sandia Cave. But there was one tiny issue. Hester found a label on one of the horse teeth that said Mousterian. Mousterian artifacts come from Europe and are actually remains of Neanderthal relics, which means that they're really, really damn old. Hester said, quote, I think I just didn't get around to mailing it. What a Chad. When asked about whether he thought Hibben was being careless or deceitful, Hester said, quote, it seemed like he was doing things that were fraudulent. But, being a lowly undergrad, Hester never felt brave enough to confront Hibben over it. What did Hibben have to say about all this? Well, he simply denied that Hester ever worked for him. Of course. That seems to be one of his go-to moves. Another scientist who raised an eyebrow at Hibben's claims was Louis Binford, one of the greatest archaeologists of his time. He is called the father of the new archaeology. He was influential in introducing more rigorous methods of fieldwork and was a proponent of scientific ethics. In the business, we call this foreshadowing. Like Hibben, Binford was known to have a very big personality, though most people described him as abrasive. Unsurprisingly, he and Hibben had a long history of disagreements. When Binford was a young sprout, he worked as an assistant in the C-14 laboratory at the University of Michigan. Sound familiar? I think you know where this is about to go. Part of his job was to inventory the stuff that came in for testing and make sure labels were all correct. Well, one day he opened a box of stuff from New Mexico. Among the items was a mammoth tooth from Sandia Cave. But something didn't seem right. The tooth was studded with pea gravel. For those who don't know, pea gravel is tiny rounded stones formed at river bottoms, not in caves. There were a lot of items in this package, not all of them from Sandia Cave, so Binford wrote Hibben a letter asking if it was a mistake and the tooth was mislabeled. Hibben replied, "Oops, silly me, that is mislabeled." Included with his supply was a box containing mammoth ivory that definitely came from Sandia Cave. All is well. Great example of efficient communication. Nope, nothing in this story is ever as it seems. The fragments of mammoth tusk had a calcium carbonate crust on them. Not unusual, but Binford ran a few tests on the material that produced puzzling results. See, when calcite is precipitated from water, it's not just pure calcite. It has a soup of other elements that come from the water. So if two items are coated in calcite with the same elemental mix, it's a good indicator that they came from the same place. The tusk material and the tooth from before had the exact same calcium carbonate. Binford was confuzzled. Hibben had confirmed that the tooth did not come from Sandia Cave, but assured Binford that the tusk had. Well, Binford's mama didn't raise no bitch, so Binford confronted Hibben about his findings. How did that go? Well, according to Binford, quote, Hibben got angry and called my boss and said, "I don't know who this person is and what the hell he's doing with my specimens." Binford's superiors brushed the inconsistencies away, ran the tests, and Hibben got his famous date. Goodness gracious, this lighting is crappy, but we're going to see if we can make it work. Things got weirder. Hibben didn't ask for any of his samples to be sent back to him. So, Binford kept the pea gravel mammoth tooth and used it as a paperweight. In 1968, as chance would have it, Binford got a teaching position at the University of New Mexico. A few years after relocating to Albuquerque, he decided to build a house there. While talking with the guys who supplied the concrete for the job, they told him that they were always finding fossil bones in their quarries. Naturally, Binford was curious and asked to see for himself. So a few guys took him out to the quarry one day. And what do you think he saw? I'll give you 3 guesses. He saw pea gravel. Lots and lots of pea gravel. So Binford scooped up some of the gravel and sent it, along with his paperweight, to the lab in Los Alamos for testing. And sure enough, it was a match. It seems that the mammoth materials that Frank Hibben claimed to have found in Sandia Cave actually came from a gravel quarry. When Binford was asked whether or not he thought Sandia Cave was a fraud, he said this: "Yes, but who it may have been in Frank's little network, which would of course include Frank, there's no way to say for sure. There's no certainty that Frank did this, but it's hard to imagine that he excavated the site and didn't know that these things weren't there. Frank had a reputation in Albuquerque for, it would be kind to say, stretching things." Oof, things are not looking good for our boy Frank. And they're not going to get much better. In the 1960s, Sandia Cave was reevaluated by a pair of top-notch archaeologists. And what they found was devastating. But before we get to that, you might be wondering if anyone else ever found evidence of the Sandia culture. Surely, if such a culture existed, there would be more than one site preserving their artifacts. And if such a site were found, it would go a long way in validating Hibben's hypothesis. Well, guess what? In 1954, another Sandia site was discovered by Frank Hibben. About 50 miles southeast of Sandia Cave, in the Estancia Valley, Hibben and one of his graduate students, William Rusa, discovered more remains of the Sandia culture. They were investigating the area after a flint collector informed Hibben of artifacts to be found. Almost at once, they found a mammoth bone sticking up out of the ground. And after just a few minutes of digging, Hibben produced a beautiful Sandia point. He handed it to Rusa with a grin and said, Here's your dissertation. And so, Hibben and Russo began excavations. The site was named the Lucy site for a nearby train station. The two men discovered lots of mammoth bones and several Sandia points. But some things weren't adding up. The flint collector that told Hibben about the site, Kenneth Kendall, had been collecting arrowheads in the area for decades and never once found a Sandia point. Shortly after they started digging, Russo reportedly told some folks that he was concerned about how quickly Hibben found that first point, and he suspected that it may have been planted. As time went on, Russo began finding more and more points. A lot of people believe that Hibben was hiding them for Russo to find. That's sweet. That's like a little Easter egg hunt. However, Russo did write his dissertation on the Sandia points and seems to have become convinced that they were legit. Now, I want to quickly go over one more controversial site that Hibben discovered. For this one, we have to leave New Mexico and travel all the way to Alaska. After days of battling through fierce storms, Hibben landed a boat in Chinitna Bay. I think I said that right. And, quote, below a smoking volcano, he made a shocking discovery. The glitter of flint among the dull pebbles in the sand caught our eyes. There was a familiar shape among the litter of material at the bottom of the bank. It was as though we had never left New Mexico at all. There was no doubt about it. Lying face up, with its characteristic groove and outline revealed, at a glance, was a Folsom point. We had backtracked Folsom Man almost to his starting point. That's pretty incredible. A Folsom site in Alaska was huge. And I have to say at this point that Hibben actually did believe that the Folsom culture came from Asia. He believed that Sandia culture was earlier from Europe, but he did believe that the Folsom culture migrated from Asia. And so finding a Folsom site in Alaska was more proof that the Folsom people had come over a land bridge at the Bering Strait. I'm sorry about the lights, guys. I'm trying. But anyways, Hibben reported flint chips, fire pits, and mammoth bones from this site. Look at the shadows. Ho, ho, ho. Obviously, it was a Folsom kill site. However, in the 70s, another team of archaeologists and geologists went to the site, and they found nothing. And I mean absolutely nothing. No flint chips, no fire hearths, no mammoth bones. What's more, after digging a little deeper, they found that there was no possible way that any of these artifacts could have existed here. A geological survey revealed that that part of the bay was only 5,000 years old, and the sediments that Hibben reported his finds to come from were only a few hundred years old. Yikes. Just so you know, mammoths went extinct in Alaska about 11,000 years ago. Upon returning to the mainland states, the head archaeologist of the expedition, one E. James Dixon, asked Hibben if he could look at the artifacts he found all those years ago. Guess what? They had been lost, and so had all the original archaeological and paleontological reports. Weird. Dixon later said, quote, some people said, well, what did you expect? Yeah, to be honest, this might kind of be on you, my guy. Alrighty, remember the 1960s reevaluation I mentioned? Well, it was conducted by George Agogino, I hope I'm saying that right, an anthropology professor from Eastern New Mexico University, go Greyhounds, and C. Vance Haynes Jr. from the University of Arizona. With a name like that, you know he walks the walk and talks the talk. And indeed, both of these guys were badass scientists at the top of their field. Agogino discovered the famous Hell Gap site in Wyoming, and Haynes was regarded as the world's foremost expert in Paleo-Indian geochronology. Together, these guys were a powerhouse of investigative science. Haynes told Preston about his first time visiting Sandia Cave with Agogino. Quote, I came out of that cave the first time we were up there, and I said, George, I don't know what in hell's going on in that cave. There's something wrong here. And what did they discover was wrong? Well, they published their findings through the Smithsonian in 1986. It's linked below, of course, and it's incredibly thorough, though surprisingly readable. Even if you want very comfortable scientific papers, this one is fairly easy to get through. I recommend it. The most important claim made in this paper is that the stratigraphy of Sandia Cave is very messy, not at all well defined like Hibben claimed. The cave actually contained a, quote, labyrinth of rat tunnels. Does that sound familiar? Remember Bliss? I actually want to read you the description that Haynes gave Preston because it's hilarious. Haynes told me they found a labyrinth of recent rodent tunnels that were chucky jam full of pinon nuts and acorns, pieces of corn cobs, fragments of charcoal, pieces of old newspaper, cigarette butts, and matches. There were even unmentionables in there. Condoms and whatever. Chucky jam full. I love that. I'm going to start using that. Also, unmentionables. Nothing like bumping uglies in a cave Chucky jam full of orange Cheeto dust. UTIs are awesome. In addition to the recent garbage, carbon-14 dates showed that rats had been churning up the cave floor for at least 13,500 years. As we already know from Bliss, the cave was not in pristine condition, but now we have numbers. And these aren't even the worst numbers. Agogino and Haynes also dated the ochre layer using uranium dating. It turns out the limonite layer is over 300,000 years old. What about the bones? They all dated to younger than 14,000 years ago. It seems that Sandia Cave was inaccessible to animals between 300,000 and 14,000 years ago. You know what that means? All the artifacts recovered from under the limonite layer, everything from the so-called Sandia layer, had to have been transported from the layers above by rats. Sandia man, if he existed, could not be older than about 14,000 years. This data alone strikes a major blow to Hibben and Sandia man. But there's even more inconsistency, if you can believe that. 19 Sandia points were collected from the cave, and all of them came from under the ochre. Surely, if rats had been mixing things around, they would be just all over the place, in every single layer. Many speculated that this was proof that Hibben had planted the Sandia points. Haynes disagreed. He thinks that there was a site in the cave, but that there's no telling exactly what it was. Bless his heart, he seemed like a very, very kind gentleman. Meanwhile, Agogino and one of his grad students tore apart all the published work on Sandia Cave. They found, quote, a fog of literary contradiction and confusion, which is scholarly speak for this some bullshit. They found the descriptions of the stratigraphy did not match between the initial announcement and Hibben's 1941 report. In addition, explanations of the data were so muddled and convoluted that it was impossible to tell exactly where any artifact had been found. And so what's Agogino's conclusion from this? Quote, I was a friend of Hibben's. He's not a sleazy little fraud. He's a person who could charm his way into anything, and he probably charmed himself into believing things that weren't really there. I'm sure he believed that Sandia Cave was 25,000 years old. Okay, all of this looks horrible. But there's still one thing unaccounted for. The Sandia points themselves. Surely these distinctive, never-before-seen spearheads hint at something. Well, Preston investigated that too. Honestly, I owe so much to this guy. His article in the New Yorker is just top-notch. Absolutely brilliant piece of detective work, true journalism. This video is basically a movie adaptation of his writing. I've tried to add a lot of my own research and flair to this video, but I am so inadequate compared to this guy, and I'm leaning on him like a crutch. Hats off to you, sir. You're a real one. Anyway, Preston, the absolute Chad, tracked down one Dr. Bruce Bradley. That is a superhero alter ego if I've ever heard one. Regardless of what he does at night, during the day, Bradley is an expert on lithic tools, or stone tools. He is also one of the men that popularized the Solutrean Hypothesis, just for context. So first of all, here's some pictures of Sandia points. Their most distinctive feature is that they're single-shouldered, which I believe is this little hump right here. I'm not a lithics expert, but that seems to be the most defining characteristic of the Sandia points. And that's also the thing that kind of links them to, at least superficially, links them to Solutrean points. All right, I may not be a lithics expert, but let's read what an actual lithics expert thought of the Sandia points. When you get a collection of stuff that's found together in an assemblage, there's sort of a special look that they have. They've all basically gone through the same weathering conditions, especially if they're in a place like a cave or kill site. Even if there are different flints and obsidians, you get this homogeneous feel. It's like they go together. The Sandia points did not have this feeling of homogeneity. Some look like they had been lying outside, weathered by wind, while others look fresh, like they had been buried and protected from the elements. Furthermore, upon closer inspection, Bradley discovered evidence of modern tampering. Each point was made from different stones and with different chipping techniques. Bradley looked at the points under a microscope and found one point that clearly showed evidence of a modern grinding wheel, and another that had steel remnants on it, like someone had used a steel nail to flake it. Bradley confirmed that all of the points, except for the two just mentioned, were indeed ancient, but he also admitted that he considered the find a hoax. They needed an assemblage of artifacts that looked as Solutrean as you can get, and I think the motivation was to try to bolster the theory that Clovis originated as Solutrean, and the thing that's most distinctive about Solutrean is a shouldered point. If you could prove that Clovis originated in southwestern Europe and came across the Atlantic, my goodness. And remember, this is a guy who would later go on to be like the biggest proponent of the Solutrean hypothesis. But according to him, Sandia Cave just doesn't stack up. And because Preston is a great journalist, he talked to a bunch of other archaeologists. And I'm going to really quickly read what a bunch of other archaeologists had to say about the Sandia artifacts. Jim Judge, a professor of anthropology at Fort Lewis College, said, "Some of them are original artifacts, some are reworked artifacts." Robert York said, "A couple of the points look to me like reworked agate basin. Others look like they may be authentic." David Meltzer sorry, buddy, says, "Boy, it's a strange bunch of critters in those boxes. It's hard to make sense out of that site. I don't buy it." And Louis Binford, our old buddy, said, "I felt that two of the points were archaic points that had a shoulder put in them." Okay, so here's what we're left with. 2 probable forgeries and 17 points that are either modifications made to younger points or just out of context. None of these options are great, and all of them point to Sandia Cave not being what everyone thought. In addition, single-shouldered points have been found in the Americas before. Most of them have been found to be broken double-shouldered points, accidental screw-ups by ancient flint knappers, or resharpened and repurposed points. And speaking of resharpening, Paleo-Indians had to sharpen, repair, and replace their spearheads, so you commonly find flakes and shards more often than complete spearheads. In Sandia Cave, though, only 13 waste flakes were found, 6 at the Folsom level and 7 at the Sandia level. Even weirder, almost all of the Sandia points recovered from the cave are complete. At a typical Paleo-Indian site, the ratio of complete points to fragments is something like 1 to 50. Preston interviewed a expert on lithics who said this: "Anytime anyone shows me a complete paleo point, the hackles go up on my neck. And when they show me 2 complete paleo points, then I know something is wrong. A complete paleo point is very, very rare." But in addition to all the other problems, many of the Sandia artifacts started disappearing, preventing other scientists from looking at them. A lot of the collection was part of the Maxwell Museum, and museums often misplace things. Believe me, I know, I work in a museum. And after Hibben returned from World War II, he found that a lot of artifacts, notes, and photos were either missing or in disarray. And now we need to address the elephant in the room. You guys have seen the footage of me crawling through that cave. What did you think when you saw that? Was your first instinct, I would really love to settle down there. I want to go camping there. I want to raise a family in that cave. No, unless you're Gollum. That's pretty much the only person who would have those thoughts about that cave. Sandia Cave is not a very comfortable place to live or even camp. It's cramped and dark and smelly, and Davis Cave just nearby is a lot more roomy. That's where the folks excavating Sandia Cave would camp, and it turned out to be sterile. Paleo-Indians also didn't seem to be that fond of caves anyway. Most ancient American sites are found out on the plains, which makes sense for nomadic hunters that chase herds of prey animals. However, according to Hibben, Brian, the Harvard geologist, believed that Sandia Cave was much bigger in the Pleistocene and that the front of the cliff has since eroded and fallen away. And okay, it's time we talked about Kirk Bryan. Hibben claimed that 2 world-class scientists were deeply involved in the excavation of Sandia Cave, Kirk Bryan and Frank H. Roberts. Roberts was an archaeologist from the Smithsonian, and Bryan was a geologist out of Harvard. After Preston met and interviewed Hibben in the 90s, Hibben said he felt ambushed and unprepared for such an interview. So Preston faxed him a list of questions that he wanted answered later. Hibben replied with a 10-page fax. He dodged a lot of the important questions about the dating of artifacts from the cave, but he stressed one point in particular. He was not alone in the research of the cave, and he threw around Bryan and Roberts' names quite a bit. Hibben had this to say: Dr. Bryan was in attendance on a daily basis at the excavation of Sandia Cave, and Dr. Roberts almost as often. If Dr. Bryan or Dr. Roberts would have had any questions about the stratigraphy or the disposition of the artifacts, they had ample opportunity to correct the Sandia report before it was published. This is actually really important. If 3 high-level scientists worked extensively on the site and all came up with the same facts, maybe those facts are true. But, once again, Hibben's claims don't line up with the data. Bryan's report on Sandia Cave was published alongside Hibben's. It starts by saying, quote, "The present report is based on brief visits to Sandia Cave in 1939 and 1940, close quote. As for the geology of the cave and the facts of the stratigraphy, Bryan says they were, quote, mostly obtained by Hibben's excavations and recorded by him. When Vance Haynes researched Bryan's involvement with Sandia Cave, he interviewed Bryan's widow, who said that Bryan only ever paid 2 visits to the cave. Preston later tracked down one Ernst Blumenthal, who was one of Hibben's excavators. When asked if Robert helped in the digging, Blumenthal said, "Frank Roberts? Bullshit. Frank is dead, so you can't ask him." That is true. No arguments here. Further questioning went like this. "How many times did he come to the cave in total?" Preston asked. "My guess would be twice." "And then Kirk Bryan, the geologist?" "Kirk was there once or twice, but he was not digging. Believe me, I lived in the cave just to the north of Sandia Cave, Davis Cave. I slept there, we ate there, we were there every day." Other student workers who were asked if they remembered seeing Bryan or Roberts in the caves confirmed that neither man was there for the vast majority of the digging. So Hibben can't lean on the affidavits of these other scientists. Sandia Man and the artifacts in Sandia Cave were never publicly declared to be a hoax. But as time went on, Sandia Man started to fall out of favor. People stopped talking about him, he wasn't being taught anymore, and it was widely accepted by the archaeological community that Sandia Man was the culture that never existed. Today, Sandia Man is all but forgotten. I reached out to some archaeologist friends of mine before I made this video and asked what their thoughts were on Sandia Man. Most of them had never heard of him. The 2 that had were conflicted on whether Sandia Man was a hoax or simply a misinterpretation of data. After all we went through, you might think it's obvious that the whole thing was a hoax. How on earth was the entire scientific community fooled by Frank Hibben for over 30 years? Well, it's because of who Frank Hibben was, and also who he was not. Frank was not some bumbling amateur, nor was he a mediocre academic looking to make a name for himself. He was already a well-respected and accomplished anthropologist with nothing to prove. Frank Hibben was a brilliant scientist and a highly intelligent man. In fact, he set a record for fastest time to complete required PhD coursework at Harvard. He literally just took a break from his job at UNM and ran over to Harvard for PhD, which took him less than a year to earn. In addition, Hibben's previous work, and also a lot of his later work, was top-notch, at least for the standards of the 1930s. Things have changed a lot since then, but, he was a damn good archaeologist with a great track record. He knew what he was doing, and there was no reason to suspect anything other than greatness from him. Aside from Sandia Cave and the Alaskan nonsense, He had a clean record. Plus, Hibben was well liked by almost everyone around him. His students thought he was fantastic and could do no wrong. One student even described him as the real-life Indiana Jones. Those few who did question Hibben were fighting an uphill battle. Anyone who tried to push back against him was berated by his powerful allies. The anthropology department at UNM fought tooth and nail to discredit anyone who had concerns with Hibben's work. Government officials could make life miserable for Hibben's enemies. But the biggest reason that Sandia man as a hoax was able to survive for so long was because it's not clear that it was a hoax, even to this day. When I first started researching this story, I was pretty convinced that Hibben was a fraudster who had fabricated the whole thing. But as I read more and more about the thoughts of other archaeologists, I realized that the situation was way more complex. Many people, even those who disliked Hibben, believed that many of the artifacts from the cave were genuine. Wesley Bliss, one of the first and loudest whistleblowers, believed that there was an ancient site in the cave and that it would have been impossible for Hibben to salt the site. He disagreed with Hibben's methods and believed that Hibben was lying about much of the data, but Bliss never doubted that there was a genuine site in the cave. Of the 19 Sandia points recovered from the cave, only 2 have been proven to have modern modifications, and there's no telling where the rest of them actually came from because they're lost. In addition, one of the archaeologists I spoke with said something very interesting. He believed that Hibben was Fibbin. That's a great line. I came up with that. You like that? I'm surprised that I waited until the very end of the video to use that because it's perfect. Anyways, he believed that Hibben was Fibbin about a lot of the details of the cave, but he also said that if the discovery of Sandia Cave was announced today, he believed that a lot of people would believe it, just like before. Why? Well, because in the years since, we've discovered evidence that humans were in New Mexico as early as 23,000 years ago. The White Sands Trackway is a fascinating discovery that deserves a video of its own. We're just going to briefly touch on it here. This is not comprehensive at all. Definitely go and research this more on your own. But in short, this discovery preserves human footprints from about 23,000 years ago. Carbon dating of seeds found in the tracks first provide this age. A lot of people didn't really like that because, again, 23,000 years ago, that's a long, long time ago for people who have been in the Americas. So those dates were immediately kind of sus. It was proposed that maybe these seeds, because they came from water plants, were storing older carbon. Well, then bioluminescence dating was used on these tracks, and it provided the exact same date or within the same range. So that's pretty serious. Now, there's still some doubt, a couple people pushing back, but by and large, a lot of people are accepting that this might be the greatest anthropological find in North American history. That's how big these tracks are. Again, we're not going to go into the weeds on that, but it's awesome. In addition, more recent evaluations of Sandia Cave have prompted some researchers to assert that there was indeed a pre-Clovis culture represented in the artifacts of Sandia Cave, but not much more can be said other than that speculation. So what do I think? Well, I think there was an archaeological site in Sandia Cave. I know that doesn't really mean much. I believe there was a site in the cave. And it may have been as old as Clovis, maybe a little bit older. It might have been a separate culture. But the sad thing is that we will never know because Frank Hibben messed around. He might have found something awesome, but he did lie about data. He did try to fabricate some things. He tried to make the data say something that maybe it wasn't already saying. And because of that, the context of the cave has been destroyed. And so whatever was in that cave, we're probably never going to know. And that's a huge shame. I don't think it was a 25,000-year-old kill site. All the evidence points pretty strongly away from that conclusion. But there probably was something there that is now lost to us forever. In short, this is a story about a great man who tried to pull off one of the most insane archaeological frauds in American history. And unlike other famous frauds in this arena, like the Piltdown Man, there's no easy way to say, there, that's the lie, that's what's wrong, we can discount the whole thing. It's a very convoluted web. A lot of people these days use Hibben as an example of bad archaeology, as an example of how not to conduct yourself. And I think he's absolutely earned that. However, till the day he died, he never, ever said anything other than affirming that Sandia Cave was genuine. And he hated being called a fraud. He would threaten legal action against people that called him a fraud. So thank goodness he's dead and can't come after me now. But it's a very interesting story. And Frank Hibben's just a super interesting guy. Like, maybe he lied a lot about Sandia Cave, but some of the other things that he did in his life, you know, they sound so crazy and wild. Like the story about him doing secret missions for the State Department. Is that true? I want to say no, but at the same time, the story about him killing a lion after it broke his back and then traveling 80 miles back to civilization, that's true. He had the broken back to prove it. He's got the lion on his wall. He was a war hero. He's got the shrapnel to prove it. He was in cahoots with Richard Nixon. This guy's life is so crazy, it's almost impossible to separate fact from fiction. However, when it comes to Sandia Cave at least, I think the overwhelming scientific data has pretty clearly showed where Hibben tried to stretch the truth.
And you know what? I guess I might as well just end the video right here. No? I think so. I'm probably going to put in some supplementary footage of me just talking about geology, maybe the history of the cave, whatever I can find. You guys know how these things normally work. And I don't know why I'm describing it right now, because at this point you guys will have already seen whatever footage I decide to put in here. So, yeah, I guess that's going to be it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Big shout out to my channel members right here at the cowboy level. I appreciate everything they do. My hand is so orange. The Cheeto Man. Just call me Chester. As for the rest of you weirdos, thank you for watching again. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment below, and subscribe, and share the video. Helps the channel a whole bunch. You guys have no idea how much it helps the channel. And yeah, that's gonna be about it. I've been Gideon, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios.